Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name's Henry. I'm director of the Lafayette Club. At this point, there are quite a few people who've joined the webinar, so I think it's a good time to get started. On the 30th of August this year, the last remaining US troops withdrew from Afghanistan, ending a 20-year war. The ensuing chaos is evidence of the poorness of the execution of the withdrawal, but its implications further down the line are less obvious. With the Taliban having taken control of the country by force, the future of Afghanistan is far from certain. As such, the title of today's event necessitates careful consideration. The fall of Afghanistan. But a fall from what? A nation nearly recovered from the brutal rule of a self-elected league of religious fundamentalists, buttressed by the aid of well-meaning superpowers, or one illegitimately shackled by foreign armed forces and denied the right to self-determination. Moreover, what about its future? Will the Taliban yield to some of the Western ideals that Afghanistan has started to espouse? Or will Sharia law be enforced all the more stringently, with women and minority groups in jeopardy? Ladies, gentlemen, and honoured guests, it is with great pleasure and privilege that I introduce today's speaker, Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky needs little introduction. He's an American linguist and philosopher holding positions at MIT and the University of Arizona. He's published countless books and essays, and has been a vociferous critic of many of the US's military operations, with the war in Afghanistan being no exception. Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleased to be with you.
Although this collapse of the Afghan government has been sudden and violent, its origin stretches back decades. Could you comment on the conditions that gave rise to the Taliban's seizure of power following the Soviets' withdrawal back in the 80s?
Sorry, could you repeat?
I was just wondering if you could comment on the conditions that gave rise to the Taliban's seizure of power.
Gave rise to the Taliban?
Yeah. Seizure of power back in the 80s after the Soviets withdrawal.
We have to go back to 1979 when the Carter administration, President Carter in the United States, decided to send military aid to the radical Islamists that were seeking to overthrow the Russian-backed government in Afghanistan. The idea was to provoke the Russians to intervene. That was later explained by National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was responsible for the program. He was very proud of it. They did instigate the Russians to intervene. The Russians wanted to withdraw. Clearly, that was understood, but by then the war was on. There was the invasion got more fierce and brutal. The radical Islamists who the US was organizing got more active and violent. The goal of the US program of supporting radical Islamists was explained very clearly by the CIA chief in Islamabad who was running it. They said the goal is to kill Russians, not to liberate Afghanistan. We don't care about that. Well, won't go through all the details, but finally the Russians withdrew. They left a relatively popular government in place, the Najibullah government. It held out for a couple of years, but finally collapsed under the radical Islamist attack. They launched a reign of terror so extreme that when the Taliban moved in a couple of years later, they were mostly welcomed. That people didn't like the Taliban, but they were at least bringing some measure of peace and order. Well, then things drifted through the 1990s. The US was then on reasonably good terms with the Taliban. It was sort of didn't like them, but was kind of dealing with them. Then came September 11th, the attack on the World Trade Center. At that point, the US decided to invade Afghanistan, but only as a preliminary to much broader goals, supported by Tony Blair enthusiastically, conquer Iraq, which had nothing to do with it, and extend it beyond to broader area in the Middle East. There's plenty of documentation about this that from inside sources that has been available for many years. The attack on Afghanistan had no justification whatsoever, none. The Taliban had, there was nothing to justify an attack. Don't like them, don't like a lot of governments. The US, the attack was strongly opposed by the anti-Taliban resistance. The leading figure, Abdul Haq, gave a major interview in October, a couple of weeks after the invasion, in which he bitterly condemned the invasion, as did other anti-Taliban resistance leaders. He said it's going to kill a lot of Afghans, undermine our efforts to overthrow the government from within. The US is doing it just to show its muscle and intimidate everyone. That was essentially confirmed by Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, and also by George Bush himself when the Taliban offered to surrender totally, meaning, of course, hand over bin Laden. They refused. Rumsfeld's statement was, "We do not negotiate surrenders." Okay, and pretty soon, as Bush made clear, they had pretty much lost their interest in bin Laden or the Taliban. They were on to bigger game, invading Iraq with the full support of Tony Blair, who's now celebrating all this, I notice. I won't go on with that. It led to terrible disaster, catastrophe in Iraq and Afghanistan, spreading throughout the region. But that's the core of the story.
Okay, if we can turn our attention to the US's withdrawal now. The Doha Agreement was signed 18 months ago. There was plenty of time for the US to plan the final stages of the withdrawal. Why then do you think it ended up being carried out in such a precipitous way that caused so much chaos and destruction?
Well, that's the Trump administration. February 2020, it was an outrageous decision. Trump basically told the Taliban, we're going to leave, you can do anything you like, as long as you don't attack American forces and don't shelter Al-Qaeda. Otherwise, you're free to do what you like. That was February 2020. He didn't even consult the official Afghan government, let alone the people of Afghanistan. So it was a call for a precipitous withdrawal, which would essentially hand the country over to the Taliban. It was timed for May of this year, May 2021, absolutely worst time. That's the onset of the fighting season. Over the winter, very cold, everyone retreats into their villages. That didn't even give people, wouldn't even have give people try to time to accommodate once they learned that the US and its associates, the other British, other forces would withdraw. Biden delayed it a couple of months, a little bit better, but not sufficient. Still a precipitous withdrawal. Perfectly obvious that as soon as the US withdrew, the government, formal government, was just a morass of corruption representing very few. It's pretty obvious that that would collapse at once. And the Afghan army, a lot of which was just on paper, ghost soldiers, a lot of it was recruits who had no interest. There were forces that wanted to fight, but there was no support. So it was obvious that the army would very quickly collapse. Actually, I don't say this in retrospect. I can refer you back to the interviews months before where I was saying the same thing. In fact, anybody who was not burdened by official intelligence could see this. Official intelligence, we have plenty of records of this from Vietnam. The way the people on the ground understand what's happening. But as the intelligence gets filtered stage by stage up to higher levels, it gets modified, more or less conforming to what the people on top want to hear. So it's sort of optimistic when the people on the ground or people are just reading the newspapers can see it's a house of cards, it's going to fall apart. The one surprise, at least to me, was that the warlords, Ismail Khan, Dostum, who had been strongly opposed to the Taliban, they also collapsed very quickly, which indicates that, as seasoned observers of Afghanistan has pointed out, that indicates that the Taliban had obviously infiltrated their domains pretty significantly, because they also just collapsed. Basically, nothing left at this point. But that was, and now the Taliban are, of course, instituting a pretty harsh regime, pretty much like the one that was there before. That's...
So what does the future of the US's relationship with Afghanistan look like if they are setting in this regime that looks like the previous one? And also, how will the international community react? Do you think that the Taliban will be accepted as a legitimate government, or will they be shunned?
Well, the future depends. I mean, they'll do what they want. There's little we can do to affect it. Once Trump basically arranged for them to take over and run everything, there wasn't a great deal that could be done. I think the withdrawal could have been delayed, could have given some time period for efforts at local accommodations. Other measures might be a more benign outcome, but that's water under the bridge. The only thing we can do now is try to ease the outcome for Afghan people as much as possible. That means releasing the funds, the Afghan funds that the US holds in the US Treasury Department. They should be returned to the government. Sanctions that affect the population should be eliminated. We should be working to cooperate as much as possible especially with China, but also with other regional powers, to see if it's possible to ease the situation as much as possible for the Afghan people. They're the ones who we don't pay any attention to, but they're the ones who we should be thinking about. Now, China particularly has a strong interest in ensuring some form of stability in Afghanistan, and crucially ensuring that Afghanistan does not harbor terrorist groups. For China, that's really important. China has a small border with Afghanistan, and in the past, the terrorist groups, which in fact the US even designated as terrorist, which operate in the Chinese Western provinces, the provinces with mostly Turkic-based population, Uyghurs and others. Those, if they're based in Afghanistan, allowed to flourish there, China will face a serious terrorist problem. Same might well be true in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, Tajikistan to the north. Of course, Russia has a large, now the Russian Federation has a large Muslim population in the south. They are also concerned about the spread of Islamic based radical Islamic jihadi terrorism. So the neighboring countries have a significant interest in moving towards some degree of stability, maybe even some kind of social development in Afghanistan, and the US and Britain can cooperate with them to the extent possible. It's not an easy path, but there are some things that can be done.
Before the US invaded in 2001, there were movements aimed at dismantling the Taliban regime from within. Do you think similar movements will gain traction this time around?
Didn't catch that one, sorry.
I said before the US invaded in 2001, there were movements aimed at dismantling the Taliban regime from within. Do you think similar movements will gain traction with this regime?
Well, the Taliban didn't have to run the country. In 2001, the Taliban first made some tentative offers to send Osama bin Laden abroad, countries like other Islamic countries, where he would, of course, be immediately extradited to the United States. The US refused to consider it. Then the Taliban, this is still in 2001, 2002, offered complete surrender. Said, okay, just surrender, just let us go back, live in peace in our villages. The US refused. We do not negotiate surrender. Well, okay, then the Taliban stayed in power. Didn't have to happen. When the US invaded, at first, there was, as I said, there was strong opposition to the invasion, but much of the population was willing to tolerate it. They hoped that maybe it would bring some degree of peace after a decade of violent war, and maybe the super rich United States could even help with some development programs. So there were a couple of years of relative acceptance, but that was overwhelmed by the violence of the occupation. The night raids, attacking homes, smashing in, arresting people, humiliating them, drone attacks which murdered civilians, the shocking torture chambers that were established in Bagram and other places. The power brokers inside Afghanistan, warlords and others, were using the American forces and the British forces as a weapon against their own enemies. So some warlord somewhere would tell the Americans, this guy in the neighboring village is working for the Taliban, made it up, of course. Then the American forces would come in, smash the place up. People would be recruited for the Taliban. There's very good reporting on this, especially by Anand Gopal, was right on the ground the whole time, wrote about this years ago. American soldiers confirmed it in memoirs. So after that, pretty soon, just general opposition to the occupation. I mean, British forces could move in and what they call pacify some region. The minute they pulled out, the Taliban came back out of their villages and took over again. That's pretty much what's been going on. They gradually expanded their support. It was originally a Pashtun movement. There are many different tribes in Afghanistan, and that's the largest of the ethnic groups. But by now it's extended well beyond, as the warlords in Herat and Distum capitulated. That brought in Uzbeks and Tajiks and others under the general Taliban umbrella. There are few who still aren't brought in. The Hazara, they're subject to fierce repression, but most of them seem to be within the Taliban umbrella by now. That just seems to be a fact.
I know you spoke about Afghanistan's neighboring countries, but what do you think the implications for national security, in countries such as the US and the UK are now that the Taliban are back in power?
Well, that's the only topic discussed in the US and UK. And it's a problem, but it's the least important of all of them. It's the one we talk about because it's us. We don't care about anyone else. There is some sort of security problem. Notice that the so-called war on terror that was launched in 2001 has been an enormous gift to Islamic terrorists. The ghost of bin Laden must be celebrating when the US invaded in 2001. Jihadism of the Al-Qaeda variety was pretty much confined to a small corner of northwest Afghanistan, a few other places. Now it's spread all over the world, Africa, Asia, South Asia, and everywhere. It's a tremendous triumph for the jihadi movement, the global war on terror. There were other contributions when France and England, followed by the United States, decided to violate the Security Council resolution that they had instituted and become the air force of the rebels in Libya. That led to total chaos and catastrophe, also spreading jihadism to Western Africa, both fighters, mercenaries for Gaddafi, and many weapons. Now it's rampant all over West Africa, Philippines, elsewhere. So it's been the attack on Afghanistan has been an enormous success for radical Islamic jihadism. And is there a threat? Yeah, there is. The way to contain it in Afghanistan is to try to help the country somehow develop. The Taliban don't want Al-Qaeda. That's the last thing they want. They tried to get rid of them before. They don't want the West having pretexts to attack them. So they have their own interest in getting rid of the Islamic terrorist groups and the neighboring, especially China, but also the Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, they have similar interests. So maybe the common interests will succeed in helping the Taliban do what they probably want to do anyway, and that is control or eliminate the Islamic jihadi groups internally. That's the only way to relieve the security problem.
Are you, the other situation is kind of dire. Are you in any way optimistic for what the future has in store for the people of Afghanistan?
It's pretty hard to be optimistic, but there are hopes and there are opportunities. So all we can do is pursue those. It doesn't really matter how optimistic we feel about it. That's subjective. What matters is what we can do, what the options are, and what we must do. Instead of coming in with a battering ram and a sledgehammer and smashing everything up, we can try to do something to build. Current estimates are that the US spent $8 trillion on the Afghanistan, Iraqi, so-called global war on terror. That $8 trillion could have been used to construct viable developing societies. Same problem arises now. The US is spending about $780 billion a year on the military. That totally dwarfs all other countries. China, next greatest, is about 250 billion. Well, this is totally senseless. That money, first of all, the buildup of the military harms US security. It just creates situations which lead to tension, violence, blowback, and so on. Furthermore, that's associated with provocative actions in areas where negotiation diplomacy is possible. All of that is a race to disaster, and it can be overcome. And that's what we should be thinking about, the constructive opportunities that are available to us.
Okay, we're going to move on to some audience submitted questions now. We have one from Salma, who asks, it feels like everyone has an opinion on Afghanistan, but nobody cares about what Afghans have to say. How do we tune down the media's relentless drowning of Afghan voices? Is it just a case of listening more carefully and supporting Afghan peace groups?
Okay, I would, oh God, I'm afraid this is, because, I'm sorry, but because I had to use an extra computer, I'll have to take it somewhere else where it can get recharged. Just a second, I'll be a minute.
That's fine.
Well, it's a case of not caring. Let's go back to the US and Britain, the governments simply don't care what Afghans want, so they don't pay attention. And there are ways to do it. We can go back to the late 80s when the Russians were in the last years of the Russian invasion. Russian invasion was murderous, brutal, killed hundreds of thousands of people, but it was rather like, in some ways, like the American invasion. By the last couple of years, they had established order in the main cities, mainly Kabul. Women's rights were protected. Women could wear whatever they wanted. They were going to the university. Women's literacy sharply increased. They were given, wasn't perfect, but there were major advances. There was information about this from a very credible source. The United Nations had a representative in Afghanistan, a very well-known person in international feminist circles, Rasil Basu. She was the person who had organized, the main organizer of the UN-sponsored Year of Women a couple of years earlier. She was there with special concern for women's rights, and she wrote about it. She submitted her articles. I don't know about Britain, but she submitted her articles to the major US journals, New York Times, Washington Post, even to the feminist journal, Ms. main feminist journal. They didn't even acknowledge it. Of course, wouldn't run it, but wouldn't acknowledge it. Well, now there's a lot of expressed concern about women's rights, justifiably. Maybe some of the people are even sincere, but then an obvious question arises. Why weren't you interested in women's rights in the late 80s? The women in Kabul did face dangers, namely the US-backed radical Islamists, especially the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group, who would be throwing acid in the face of young women wearing the wrong clothes and that sort of thing. Did anybody care? Did anybody listen? Did anybody listen to the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance. I quoted a few of them, but there were many more. Also in October 2001, there was a meeting, Loya Jirga, of 1,000 elders from Afghanistan, all of them strongly opposed to the Taliban. They essentially reiterated Abdul Haq's message. They said, let us overthrow the Taliban from within. Don't undermine our efforts. You're doing it just because you want to show your muscle and intimidate everyone. Did anybody listen? Well, a few people did. I wrote about it. A couple other people wrote about it, but it never made it anywhere near either the media or the centers of power. Right through the last recent years, there have been Afghan peace forces, mostly young people, trying to organize, trying to get some outside support. It was possible to engage with them. I did to a limited extent. Certainly others could have. Nobody cared. Well, it's not easy, especially now, won't be easy to assess what Afghans may want, but we should do our best to try to find out. It's the population on the ground that matters. The elites, mostly, they can flee. They'll be out of it. But that's what we can do. We've made it much harder for ourselves than it could have been, but there still are possibilities.
Okay, we have a question from Aina, who asks, the language barrier is often a major obstacle for different marginalized voices that want to reach the West and contributes to Western media channels maintaining power over what news gets to the public. In the case of the situation in Afghanistan, for instance, translators or activists from Afghan communities in the West have had to play a major part in illuminating different parts of the debate that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. How can this obstacle be alleviated, if at all?
It's an obstacle, but it's not overwhelming. First of all, by now there are a small group of people who are familiar with the Afghan languages, and there are plenty of translators. And many of them, actually, the better educated of them, know English. So sure, it's an obstacle, but not the most serious one. The most serious obstacle is our long-standing unwillingness to bother to listen to the Afghan people. That's at home. If we can overcome that, not just the Afghans, it's true in many other places. If we can overcome that, then we can find ways to overcome things like lesser but significant barriers.
This question is from Morgan. Do you think that the manner of the Western withdrawal from Afghanistan has shifted the United States' collective self-image? How has the West changed in its purpose since 1979 and 2001?
Well, actually, I just wrote an article about it. If you want to look it up, it's on Truth Out, where I go through a lot of examples. So let's take, we're now at the double anniversary, 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan. Well, if you want to get some information about that, who do you interview if you're in the major press? You obviously interview the person who was responsible, who proudly called himself the decider, the one who made the decisions to invade Afghanistan, invade Iraq. That's the first person you'd interview. George W. Bush. Can't interview Rumsfeld because he passed away recently, but we have his pronouncements. So you interview Bush and see, what do you think of it after 20 years? They do interview Tony Blair, but that's just a joke. No point paying attention to him. But Bush, of course, should be interviewed. And there was indeed an interview in the major press. I managed to find one. One was in the Washington Post, the national press. It was in the style section of the press, timed with the withdrawal. And what it portrayed is what they called a lovable, goofy grandpa talking to his children, admiring the paintings he had, the portraits he had painted of the great men that he had met during his time in office. And in general, just a lovely family. They did mention, there was a side mention of the fact that he had invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. But then they said, they said, whatever may have happened, he wasn't as bad as Trump because he didn't call his opponents bad names. Okay, that's what's really serious. A couple million people died, countries destroyed, ethnic conflict instigated that spread and destroyed the whole region. What do we care? He didn't call his opponents bad names, didn't call them evil. That actually encapsulates pretty well the commentary that's taken place, massive commentary in the last couple of days. So there's lots of things. For example, I quoted just before the assessment that $8 trillion had been spent, the cost to us, okay? What about the cost to the Afghan people or the Iraqi people or the Syrian people, because it's ethnic conflict spread there and so on? We don't try to estimate that. It's, first of all, you couldn't estimate it, it's too huge, but it's not the cost to us, okay? Has that changed since 1990, 2000, when we didn't care at all about the people? Well, not among elite, not in the political class, among elite sectors. Among the general population, there have been changes. There's more concern now for the effects of our crimes and atrocities, much more now than there was then. Not enough, but it is a change in the general mentality of the public. And it partially seeps into media, a couple of commentators, a few other things, but it hasn't overcome the major concentration on us. Actually, the same is true of 9/11. When I refer to 9/11, what year comes to your mind? 2001. Why not 1973, the first 9/11? Much worse than what we call 9/11. First 9/11 we celebrate because we carried it out, just like radical jihadis are celebrating the second 9/11. If we turn the first 9/11 into per capita equivalence, which is the right way to measure, it's as if on September 11th, 2001, it's as if 30,000 people had been killed, 500,000 tortured, the government overthrown, a vicious, murderous dictatorship imposed. That would have been like what happened on the first 9/11, much worse than what we call 9/11. Well, anyone should know that I'm talking about Chile, the 9/11, 1973, when the US succeeded in overthrowing the government and carrying out just what I described. The perpetrators of that are honored, respected. The main one was Henry Kissinger. He was the point man. Do we punish him for his crimes? That's a joke. We honor him for his achievements. Well, that's 9/11. Now we can go on. Let's talk about the forever wars. You've heard that phrase. Finally, we've managed to end the forever wars. From the point of view of the victims, when did the forever wars start? Well, for the United States as an entity, a formal entity, the forever wars started in 1783. The British had imposed restrictions on the colonists, and for their own Britain's own imperial reasons. It didn't want the colonists to expand beyond the eastern mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, into the territory of what was called the Indian nations. The British had too many problems in the world. They're fighting a war in India, they're fighting with France and Spain. They didn't want more problems there. So they restricted the colonists to the eastern zone, east of the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists weren't having any of that. They wanted to expand to the west to carry out campaigns of ethnic cleansing, extermination, violation of treaties, extreme brutality, until they, meanwhile, conquering half of Mexico in a war of aggression, till they expanded to what are called the national territories. Well, from the point of view of the victims, when did the forever wars start? From the first moment, and they've never ended. After the national boundaries were reached, it expands into the rest of Latin America, interventions, often violent. Philippines kill a couple 100,000 people. On Vietnam, the worst atrocity since the Second World War, many others. That's the forever wars. The US has barely had a war in its history, a year in its history when it wasn't at war. I don't have to talk about the British. You've got your own story. It starts with British wealth comes from piracy during the Elizabethan age. Gangsters like Sir Francis Drake, on to the worst system of slavery in human history in the British Islands and the French Islands and the Caribbean, and then in the South, then the most astonishing narco-trafficking enterprise in all of history in the 19th century. Conquer India so you can raise more opium to use to force in and by gunpoint into China. That's British wealth. Won't talk about the crimes and atrocities. It's not the first thing you learn in your history classes. It ought to be. But from the point of view of, we're asking about, do we listen to the victims? If we listen to the victims, this would be the history we'd tell.
Okay, this question is asked by Finlay. As portrayed in Adam Curtis's Bitter Lake and elsewhere, it seems that the Taliban as a continuous entity is not understood or easily identifiable. To what extent does the media, towing the line, oversimplify a complex network of groups, characterizing them simply as the Taliban?
And from about 1996 up to 2001, the Taliban were, like them or not, they were basically the government of Afghanistan. Now they're the government of Afghanistan again. They had a presence the whole time. As I said, British forces come in, clear them out of some area. They don't clear them out. They go back to their villages and wait until the British forces leave, then they come out and take over again. That's been the last 20 years. So yes, they're a continuing entity. Did a lot of rotten things. Other governments do a lot of rotten things. The longer we were there, the worse it got. Could have stayed longer, made it worse, but they happen to be pretty much a continuing entity. We can't change that history. We could have changed it in the past, For example, in 2001, we could have supported the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance. We didn't, but we could have. Same even in the days when the Russians were there. We didn't have to have a policy that was designed, to quote the officials in charge, a policy designed to kill Russians with no concern for the liberation of Afghanistan. We didn't have to have that policy. We didn't have have to have a policy of supporting the most vicious of the radical Islamist groups, like the Hekmatyar group, when they were trying to undermine the women's rights that had been established in Kabul. Didn't have to do that. Run through the history, lots of things we didn't have to do, could have been done otherwise. Well, the first thing we should do now is be honest with ourselves about what actually happened, and then make sure that we don't repeat that story. We are now poised to repeat that story. The institutions haven't changed. The political culture has barely changed. As we indicated, every reason to expect that it'll go on. Doesn't have to.
This question is from Tamsin. Regarding the atrocities taking place in Panjshir, as well as the many women protesters and journalists who have recently been targeted and either beaten or killed by the Taliban, why is the world turning a blind eye to this? Why are so many world leaders keen to accept a terrorist group as the leaders of Afghanistan through following a false narrative that, quote, the Taliban have changed?
If you're a supporter of the Taliban, you should ask that question. You should ask, why are you saying you changed when you didn't? If you're an opponent of the Taliban, it's not the question you ask. When we were fighting Nazi Germany, we didn't ask, why is Hitler murdering Jews? That's not the question we asked. Okay, that's for supporters of the Nazis to ask. So for us, the Taliban leadership said that they were going to be more moderate. You look at their practice so far, they haven't been. You want to know why? If you're interested in Afghanistan, there's a number of possible reasons. One is they were just lying. Another is, which actually most of the experts on the Taliban believe, is that the leadership did change, but the younger people, the leadership is the older people, the younger people and the people on the ground, they haven't changed. And they're just imposing the old system. Which is the right answer? Well, it's of academic interest to us. It's significant for people who want to understand Afghanistan and the Taliban. Question we should be asking is, why has our leadership not changed? Why is Tony Blair on television celebrating the major atrocities for which he shares responsibility? That's the question we should be asking, not about the Taliban leaders.
We have a question from Nathan, who asks, has the current situation in Afghanistan vindicated aspects of neoconservatism? If not, why not?
I didn't quite grasp it. Has it been?
Has the current situation in Afghanistan vindicated aspects of neoconservatism?
Well, what it has shown, it's a very interesting question. The so-called new conservatism reached its peak with Trump, who was the worst recent criminal, the worst of the current criminals. He's the one in February 2020 who made a deal with the Taliban, selling out the Afghan people totally for his own personal reasons. He wanted to get credit for pulling the troops out, knew that'd be popular. He said, you can do anything you like to the Afghans, we don't give a damn. Just don't harm our troops. Okay, that was the absolute nadir, the worst of the policies. That's Trump, February 2020. Up until a couple of weeks ago, the Republican National Committee had that on their website with their praise for the historic achievement of Trump in arranging to pull out. A couple of weeks ago, they pulled it off their website. Why? Because now they can use the debacle for which they are largely responsible to blame on the Democrats and to condemn Biden, even to call him for being impeached. That's the political class, okay? Up until you see the debacle that you've caused, you praise it for its historic importance. As soon as you see the debacle, pull it off your webpage, start to pretend you were the ones who always were defending the Afghans, Afghan women, and so on. You were the worst enemy. And now pretend you were defending them and try to defame the person who's wrongly, in my opinion, carrying out the policy you instituted, and even try to call for his removal from office. It's the ultimate in cynicism. And the fact that the question can even be asked is shocking. Yes, of course, neoconservatism is going to say, yes, we're vindicated, with the most extreme cruelty and cynicism that can be imagined. That's a comment about us, not about the Taliban. That's the kind of thing we should be concerned with. Governments, intellectual classes, political classes that can tolerate this kind of thing.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time, so I think we'll make the next question the last one. This is asked by someone whose name I don't know, but they ask, how does Joe Biden hold up to the Nuremberg laws? By this, they are referring to your own analysis of US presidents and their violation of the Nuremberg Laws. Oh, sorry, that was Ross who asked that.
Yeah, well, Biden hasn't been in office long enough to have committed major war crimes. So we'll have to see. But I think he's done some things that are wrong, like following Trump's withdrawal program. I don't think he should. I mean, he did improve it slightly. He delayed it a long couple of months, which gave Afghans a little time to try to accommodate. But he should not have carried out a precipitous withdrawal of the kind that Trump instituted. But I don't think you can call that a major war crime. The wrong thing to do, but not that. So we'll see. He's already committed serious crimes, but they're not called war crimes. In fact, they're not even reported. So the most serious crime he's committed so far was when the IPCC report came out a couple of weeks ago, came out on a Monday, the latest of the IPCC reports with very dire warnings about heating the climate and a call for serious measures to reduce the use of fossil fuels, starting right now, doing it year by year, to end them by mid-century. That was Monday. Tuesday, the next day, Biden issued an appeal to OPEC, the major oil cartel, calling on them to increase oil production so as to lower gas prices in the United States, which would improve his electoral prospects. Okay, so far that's the worst crime, just as Trump's worst crime, far beyond anything else, was his dedicated effort to destroy the environment as rapidly as possible for the benefit of profits for his rich constituency. These things don't get reported much, but those are the real crimes. They're not called war crimes. There's no name for them. In fact, I can't think what name could be appropriate for moving to try to destroy the prospects for organized human life on Earth. Even Hitler didn't try to do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Chomsky. I know how valuable your time is, and it's really great that you spent some of it with us. So thank you. And thanks to everyone who's joined, and thanks to people that submitted questions. I'm sorry if we couldn't ask Professor Chomsky your question, but we've been inundated with them. So yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Sorry for the computer disruption.
Oh no, don't worry about that at all. All right. Thank you. Bye.